Welcome to Lunch and Learn, everybody. It's been quite a while since we've done this with the West Michigan Symphony. I'm Scott Speck, music director, and I'm joined by our guest artist for the week, Tessa Lark. Hey, Tessa.
Hello.
Tessa's joining us for a program that is called An American Portrait. And this program really demonstrates many different aspects of American music, starting with a wonderful piece by William Grant Still called Out of the Silence, two pieces by Aaron Copland, John Henry, which you might or might not know, and Appalachian Spring, which you almost certainly do know. And then we're really featuring something special, a violin concerto by Michael Torke, contemporary composer, called Sky, that was written for Tessa. And I thought we would talk about this to start with.
Sure.
This is the first time, Tessa Lark, that we've had you here in Muskegon for the West Michigan Symphony. Tell us a little bit about your background. Where do you come from?
Sure. I don't come from Muskegon. It's my first time here. It's great to be here. I was born and raised in Richmond, Kentucky, which is in eastern Kentucky, just south of Lexington, for those of you who know Kentucky well. My father, by profession, is a wildlife biology professor, but in his spare time, he plays bluegrass banjo. So I grew up with a lot of bluegrass in the house, and actually 2 years before I ever picked up the violin, I was playing Boil 'em Cabbage Down on the mandolin. So
Whoa.
bluegrass, yeah, was my way in to music. And then when I started formal training with the violin, I started with the Suzuki method, which is a common way that people get started on the fiddle, and my teacher, Catherine McGlasson, would always supplement my Suzuki training with fiddle tunes. So the two, classical and fiddle, were always a part of my training growing up. And then from there, I started studying in Cincinnati with this wonderful teacher, Kurt Sussman's house, and he sort of opened my eyes to the big world of, being a classical violin soloist, and that's what brought me to the Northeast. I went to school at NEC.
New England Conservatory in my hometown of Boston.
Yes,
Great.
right, yeah. And studied with Miriam Fried there, and then went to the Juilliard School, and that's how I ended up in New York City, where I am right now.
Great. And so the kind of music that we're playing on this program is very familiar to you from your background. So not only the concerto, which of course being written for you, I'm sure there was some consideration given by Michael Torke to, okay, what does Tessa really do well? And among the many things you do well is at least you're very conversant in the fiddling style, which you couldn't just ask any classical violinist to do. But then the other pieces on the program, I feel also have a connection. As an example, one of the Copland pieces that we're playing is called John Henry. It's the story, it's the legend of John Henry, who was a railroad worker who competed against a machine for the ability to drive spikes into the ground for the railroad. And in the legend, he beat the machine, but then promptly died. And that was turned into many different songs and a legend. And there's one song, I think it's just called John Henry, that Aaron Copland used for his piece. Could you play a little bit of it for us?
Sure, I'll just step over here.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it has some of the same progressions and some of the same melody. And Aaron Copland took some liberties with it. What's really interesting is that when you hear this piece of music by Aaron Copland, you actually hear the sound of the railroad spikes. He writes that there's a part for an anvil. Very few people have written for anvil, Verdi did in the Anvil Chorus of Il Trovatore, very famously. But, that very, very loud metal-on-metal sound. And interestingly, Copland writes a little asterisk at the bottom of the score. It says, any metal object will do. But I think we're using something very close to an anvil for that sound. Why don't we listen to a little bit of John Henry right now? We'll hear an orchestral performance and see what you think. So that's a taste of John Henry, which is going to be on the program that the West Michigan Symphony plays, An American Portrait. The program opens, though, actually, with a piece by William Grant Still, fantastic composer. We have a traumatic relationship with this composer because it was his Afro-American symphony that we were just about to play when the world shut down. And I remember, I mean, all of us remember vividly that we were just about to go into our dress rehearsal. It was a Thursday. Thursday night would have been the dress rehearsal. And that afternoon, we got the word that everything had been shut down. Not only could we not do the dress rehearsal, we couldn't do the concert, we couldn't do the next concert and the next concert, and everything for the rest of the season was canceled. It was really a really sad time for all of us. During this time of silence, when orchestras were silenced, I don't know about you, but I found myself really needing, craving the sound of a real orchestra, the sound of a live orchestra. And so in bringing back music of William Grant Still, we chose a piece called Out of the Silence. This is a piece that calls for a flute solo, piano solo, and the strings of the orchestra. To me, this piece is reminiscent of the great impressionist music of Maurice Ravel or even Claude Debussy. But it seems to have a very contemplative and, to some extent, even mournful quality. Well, here's a little excerpt of Out of the Silence by William Grant Still. The piece that's going to end our program is the one that all of you know, Appalachian Spring, or as Tessa will correct me, Appalachian Spring. I believe that all his life, Copland called it Appalachian Spring, and he didn't even know it was supposed to be pronounced Appalachian until he was an old man. So I'm going to also follow his lead and call it that.
You have historical context for it. Yeah. That's great.
Appalachian Spring is probably his most known and loved piece, other than or along with Fanfare for the Common Man. An incredible piece that he actually wrote, believe it or not, without any kind of Appalachian context in mind. He was writing music to be used for a ballet choreographed by Martha Graham, the great American dancer, truly one of the great artists of all time. And he wrote this ballet. It was maybe half an hour long, a little longer, and he called it Ballet for Martha. And she, when she heard the music, was reminded, or somehow the music to her evoked an Appalachian scene. And what it is a young couple are just getting married, and they're moving into this new home together, and they're taught about the ways of the world by an older neighbor. There's some fire and brimstone preaching. There's a barn dance. And at the end, according to Copland, the couple are left quiet and strong in their new house. So that was Martha Graham's scenario for it. She actually gave it the name Appalachian Spring, and that is actually the title of a poem by Hart Crane. So it's really quite amazing that we think of all these associations. You say, oh yeah, that's the barn dance. Oh yeah, that's the preacher saying, talking about fire and brimstone. Oh, this is the couple praying at the end. But actually, none of that was in Copland's mind when he wrote it. Martha Graham's choreography gave us forever a scene that we play in our heads when we hear this music. I thought maybe we would just listen to a couple examples. First of all, Copland builds the entire piece of music on two triads. Basically, we hear da 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 and ba da da. It sounds a lot better by the orchestra. You're laughing. You're laughing at me, Tessa. Anyway.
No, it's perfect. I'm just
Yeah.
overjoyed by how beautiful it was.
But those two triads, those two chords, arpeggios of those two chords, are played together. So you hear these two seemingly somewhat dissonant chords, but not wildly dissonant, just gently dissonant. Played together, you hear them separately, and then you hear them as very, very fast arpeggiation, like ba-ba-ba, 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 ba-ba-ba. So let's listen first to a little bit of the very beginning of Appalachian Spring, and hopefully you can hear these two triads being played in the orchestra. So that's the opening of Appalachian Spring. And now I want you to hear what comes next. It's very, very lively and sprightly, and you'll hear that it's also completely built on these arpeggios as well as some scales. Here's the fast and furious second section of Appalachian Spring. So those are two of the sections. You know them, Appalachian Spring. It's an absolutely delightful piece. More than that, it's a pretty perfect composition. And what we're playing is actually the suite. Now, Copeland sort of condensed the ballet. He took out what he called the purely choreographic sections, so that we now have all the themes, and he put it together. This is something people don't realize about Aaron Copland, because they think of him as, the dean of American music, the guy who created the American sound in music. His music somehow evokes wide open spaces. I think it's because of open fifths. Bum, ba, that's an open fifth, something like that. Open fifths without a third necessarily make you feel expansive. I don't know if you agree. To me, it makes.
I totally agree. Yeah, yeah. The wide open. Yeah, you can almost see the Appalachian valleys when you hear his music, and it totally is iconically American.
But if you think about it, he also wrote Rodeo, right? About a rodeo. He wrote Billy the Kid. And so, there's all this music that he wrote that evokes wide open spaces, whether it's on, near the East Coast or whether it's out in the Wild West. Interestingly, he was a Jewish guy from Brooklyn, but he became associated with this style. Anyway, that plus fanfare for the common man and so on. What people don't realize is that before he hit upon this musical language, he wrote music that was as thorny as anyone who was writing crazy atonal music in the first half of the 20th century. But along with that, he learned incredible details and skills of compositional technique, and his compositional structure is unassailable. It's fantastic. That's what's so disarming about Appalachian Spring. It's a beautiful structure, but you don't know that when you hear it. You just know that you really enjoy listening to it. Now, this music, this Appalachian music, is something that you actually have also hit upon in a fantasy that you wrote, that you composed. Wow, you composed it. And you're going to perform it right here in the block for our other concert with you this week. So tell us about that and about the music.
Yeah, thanks. It's called my Appalachian Fantasy. I wrote about half of it, but as Aaron Copland was one to do, and so many other of the greatest composers of all time, I took cues from other composers and other tunes and sort of crafted them into something else for my Appalachian Fantasy. So
traditional tunes, fiddle tunes, things
traditional
like that?
tunes and even classical tunes. I used a song by Schubert, and I used a melody actually from Brahms, and there are things that you can't really hear in the music, but the structure of those melodies were great inspiration for me. And then later on in the piece, I actually use a traditional fiddle tune called Bonaparte's Retreat, which is a tune that Aaron Copland also used.
Can you show us a little bit of that, perhaps?
Yeah. So the recognizable part is the... But there's several different versions of the tune, depending on what region you learned the fiddle tune from. That's pretty common in fiddle tunes, even with John Henry probably is the same case. So this is another version. So that's a more, still similar, but more old-timey feel to it.
And you mentioned that Bonaparte's Retreat was also referenced in Copland's own Hoedown. Is that right? So, and you can hear that. So, I mean, now this is really interesting because you obviously are very comfortable and conversant with the fiddling style. Can you describe how it differs from classical violin playing, for example, a Tchaikovsky concerto? And one thing I can hear, you're not using vibrato. You're not vibrating the string when you play fiddle. Is that? Would you say that's fair to say?
Yeah, I'd say that's fair. Vibrato is used in fiddle music, but it's usually quite slow. I would say it's maybe more similar to what we think vibrato was in Baroque times. But for sure, that really straight pitch drone sound is very bluegrassy, very fiddly. To me, it sort of harkens back to bagpipe sounds, and there's a lot of Scots-Irish influence in the Appalachian region where I grew up. So, of course, there is that inspiration
Right.
in the music. And otherwise, I would say that rhythm is maybe more of the priority in folk music and Appalachian music than it is in most classical music, when melody and harmony and overall structure takes more priority. And of course, rhythm is crucial, but the groove is so differently felt in folk music, and you very much feel that in the bow. So you might be using your bow differently as well.
I see. Now, our composer for your concerto, Michael Torke, obviously took inspiration from this. I first became aware of Michael Torke when he wrote something called color music, and there's a wonderful CD of it that you can find or a recording online with the Baltimore Symphony, David Zinman conducting several movements. I think that he has synesthesia, and he feels that certain keys, like D major, he thinks is blue. And different people have different thoughts about that. And I have a little bit of synesthesia myself, and I don't necessarily associate D major with blue. And I think that I was once on the bus, actually, this was at the Aspen School of Music, with a bunch of Aspen students, several of whom have synesthesia. There's something weird about that. So synesthesia is where you experience something with one sense, and it immediately kicks in another sense. Like you might hear music, and suddenly it gives you a fragrance, but most often it's associating with colors with something that have nothing to do with color. So I swear I heard this conversation on the bus. Wednesday is brown. No, Wednesday is purple. That's synesthesia. Anyway, so color music, he wrote movements, or different pieces actually, with names like ecstatic orange, or bright blue music, or ash. And I find this music to be completely aside from whether I agree that he's chosen the right key for each for each color. Completely aside from that, I find the music to be incredibly accessible. I guess you could say it's a kind of minimalism, a lot of it is. Minimalist music is where certain rhythmic or melodic motives are repeated over and over and over and over. You might say Beethoven's Fifth is a minimalist piece because it has a ba-ba-ba-ba everywhere, but Philip Glass, John Adams, Steve Reich, Terry Riley, these are composers who made minimalism famous in the classical world. And I think Michael Torke uses that, but he's not limited by it. And that's one thing I love. So now, how did you get connected with this amazing American composer?
Yeah, I was playing a recital at Carnegie Hall's Weill Hall, and they have an amazing commissioning program. And so they offered to commission a composer to write a piece for that recital. And Michael Torke was my pick. And so he wrote me a sonata called Spoonbread, which is a staple food dish in Kentucky. And he titled the movement, he's just great with titles. He titled the movements after the main ingredients in spoonbread: cornmeal, milk, and eggs.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's really funny. And then that was 2017, and when we were recording the sonata, he asked me in the recording session if I would be interested in playing a concerto of his if he were to write a bluegrass-inspired concerto, because we got to know each other a lot more in that process. Yeah. And the recording engineer who was in the room said, "I'll record it." And then they contacted their dear friends at the Albany Symphony with David Allen Miller, and they said, "Of course, we'll record it too." And that's how it happened. And then a big, consortium of orchestras made that possible. But it was super fun to work with Michael pretty intimately on the composition process. He was very generous and vulnerable in letting me see a lot of his drafts and sort of asking me about different bluegrass Irish musicians that he was discovering, because this was very new music to him.
Right.
So that was all really a fascinating process.
Right. Well, what I think is really interesting is that you can hear all the way throughout, all three movements, you definitely hear fiddling, but it's not just fiddling. I mean, by not just, I don't mean that in any derogatory way, but it's like, it's not purely fiddling. He definitely is adding certain strange, Torquean harmonic progressions and things like that he would have put into his minimalist music. Let's talk a little about the first movement, because I think if I understand right, this is supposed to imitate banjo picking. Is that right?
Exactly.
So tell us about that.
Yeah, this is actually some material that Michael and I went back and forth on, and he said, I think it'd be cool to put banjo-style picking in the violin, and he sent some stuff, and I said, that's not going to be cool on the violin.
Well, he's talking about plucking, yeah?
Yes.
He's talking about plucking, and to pluck the violin at that speed would be less cool.
Right, yeah, that would be less cool, but it was always originally to be played with the bow on the violin, at least the way he was imagining it, but for sure it's with, picks on the banjo or old-time style without the picks. But he was open to my opinions, but of course he needs to do what he believes in, and so I said, this might sound a little awkward, and he said, whatever, I'm going to do it anyway. And so then the entire first movement is this very technique that I wasn't sure about.
Oh, that you didn't think would be cool. Can you demonstrate a little bit? I think we need to hear this.
Yeah, of course. Hopefully it doesn't sound anymore like I was awkward for me.
Yeah. All right. Whoa, I just wanted to stomp my feet and clap on the offbeats there.
Yeah, so it's like, it's like music I've never seen written for the violin, and so it took me a while to figure out how to do it, but in the end he was totally right. He knew, and that's why you work with brilliant
Great
composers like
yeah.
him, because he really hit on a new violin sound and a new concerto sound.
Fantastic. And the orchestra has a challenge at the beginning, because Tessa's playing that melody, which is da-da-da-da-da-da, but we don't play anything on the beat. All we play is the offbeats. So, it's like da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and we're doing the snap. And to do just that with an orchestra that's far flung, 40 feet from one side to the other, something like that, is a fun challenge.
Yes.
So the whole first movement is like that, although there are some moments where it gets very wistful and nostalgic almost, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are beautiful words to describe a lot of Michael's music, too. He reminds me of, in a way, of a Beethovenian sort of character in that he's quite an earnest and mostly serious man, also just a beautiful human being all around, but then his music is the most joyous that I've heard at times. And he had these really, really gorgeous melodies in the first movement. I mean, all over the whole concerto, but the wistful ones that you're talking about. Let's see.
Just beautiful.
These and really unusual leaps and jumps, but still there's this beautiful pearl-like thread throughout all of these tiny gestures, and it makes, like you said, a very wistful and delightful melody.
Yeah. And you mentioned Beethoven. I was just thinking about one of the first pieces I ever conducted of his, Bright Blue Music, just sounds like Beethoven. It sounds like you're taking 3 measures of Beethoven and riffing on it for 10 minutes, which is really quite cool. Now the second movement seems to be based, it feels like it's a Celtic reel or something, but slowed down.
Yes.
Is that what it is?
Yeah, so I will actually play for you the tune that inspired Torquay to write the second movement, and then I'll follow that directly with what he did with it, and you'll hear right away the similarities. So this is the original Irish tune. And then Michael's version is. etc. So there's striking similarities. He changes the meter and different things as well. And then, as you said, of course, his orchestration, which I think is one of Torque's primary genius, just amazing colors, makes it a totally different thing.
Yeah.
But it's, yeah, exactly inspired by Irish music, and then it goes on to different, to the late night bar and, like different styles of that Irish inspiration in the second
And
movement.
you talk about orchestration. There are several parts through the entire concerto where a flute, oboe, and clarinet are playing in unison. And in this second movement, they are echoing that theme that you just played. You'll play a phrase, and then they'll play the same one. Or, even more notably, they'll play it, and then you come in and play it, which I think is really, really interesting.
Yeah.
And yes, the way that the instruments of the orchestra are really trusted to play incredibly well. I'm thinking about the third movement now. The third movement has, among other things, a crazy solo for a trombone in
Yes.
it, in which the trombone does sort of, I guess you'd say at a recapitulation kind of moment, does what you do at the beginning. It's like he is playing your part. It's like suddenly it becomes a trombone concerto for a little while. And there are other wonderful things, really fast things as well for the flute, oboe, clarinet, and some great percussion moments as well. Show us a little about the third movement.
Sure. This one is the biggest barn burner of the three, and I think the most overtly country and bluegrassy, I would say, especially the opening, which is what I'll play for you.
Woo!
Yeah, and all those slides, everything are written in there. It's pretty amazing how quickly Torquay picked up all the different nuances in fiddle music. But that one's so much fun, that third movement.
And the third movement also includes long sections where you're kind of feeling an accent every 5 beats. It's like
Yes.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4. And you get in that groove, someone might not even realize that this is a highly unorthodox groove for country music in 5. I don't know of any other pieces. That's what's so cool about this to me, is that he's taken some real bluegrass elements that feel thoroughly, utterly authentic, and he's put them into a compositional structure that is extraordinarily complex. And like Copland, though, it works on both levels. You can analyze it, which I did. I did. Or you can just listen to it and enjoy it. And it's one of the most enjoyable modern concertos I've ever heard. And I think the audience will feel the same way.
It's great. Yeah, actually, to that odd 5/4 sort of feel, there are in a couple of old time tunes this thing called a backstep. I'm blanking in terms of giving examples, but sometimes there are moments, not like you said, never really a whole 5/4 piece, but where the rhythm will get a little lopsided, and that's actually called backstep. So Torquay took that backstep element and then created the whole piece out of it. But it's so much fun to play and to listen to, and I have to say, the symphony here is really playing it with incredible groove and style, which is hard to do with this music. So it's been such a pleasure.
Well, one thing about the West Michigan Symphony is that everyone is, they're at the top of their game, but they're also really sincere about wanting to make it work. And here they are now playing it, this piece, with the person who premiered it, for whom it was written. And also, you've done it, what you say, about 8 or 9 times.
Something like that,
But
yeah.
you mentioned earlier a consortium of orchestras, which is a bunch of different orchestras who come together to commission it. So in other words, the fee to the composer is split up among all these orchestras, and they normally get to play it before anyone else in the world does. We did the same thing with a piece by Jennifer Higdon several years ago called On a Wire. We were one of, something like 20 orchestras that co-commissioned this. In your case, how many different orchestras?
7 orchestras.
7 orchestras.
Yes.
But very interestingly, due to the craziness of the last year, not all 7 have gotten to play it yet. Is that right?
Right.
That's right.
Yeah, yeah.
So-
So there's an orchestra still in Portland, Oregon, and so we have postponed probably to 22, 23
Whoa.
season because of the pandemic, of course. But I feel like those consortiums are a great way to go with new commission works because you ensure that the world gets to hear it. And I think for a lot of new music, it's worth having several listens to really appreciate what the new music is. I do have to say, however, I found when I heard this Torquay concerto for the first time, it just catches right away. It's really an easy and a fun listen immediately.
I think it's even easier to listen to for someone who has no stake in trying to make it happen in the moment, because you can just relax. You can just totally relax and listen to it and get in the groove,
Yes.
rather than thinking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But we are honored at the West Michigan Symphony to be among, to be playing this in the time in which the consortium orchestras who actually paid for the piece are playing it too. So that's another way in which we at the West Michigan Symphony try to be on the cutting edge in this, a portrait of America. Boy, I can't wait to do this, and I hope our audience will enjoy it as much as we enjoy playing it. So that is Friday night. That's A Portrait of America. And then Saturday, Tessa's solo recital, including her own Appalachian Fantasy. Yeah?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tessa Lark.
Thank
Great to be with
Scott.
you.
It's amazing to be here.
Yeah. And we'll see you this weekend. Take care.